Hey everybody, Ben Smith here to talk to you about working capital. So sometimes it's called net working capital because working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. It's the relatively liquid portion of enterprise capital for meeting current obligations during the operating cycle. A distinction between fixed capital and circulating capital during the early 1900s was brought about because they recognized the difference in method of consumption, rate of use, and length of life. So think about the difference between a machine and a temporary investment. Problems with working capital. Well, there's different ways to measure the components, different ways to measure inventory, FIFO and LIFO. There's different opinions on what should be included as elements. So not only how do you measure inventory, but should it even be included in working capital? Lack of precision in the meaning of key terms such as liquidity and current. So who cares? Well, we have creditors mainly interested in liquidity, but they're also interested in your profits, your net income, especially over the course of a long loan. Investors generally recognize that earning capacity is tied directly to stock price. So your buy and hold investments, your investors are very interested in working capital. Components of working capital: liquidity, the actual cash, the ability, the cash to pay for short-term obligations, the capability, especially if you get into a pinch, to quickly convert some of those current assets, maybe some temporary investments, into cash. Current assets, reasonably expected to be realized in cash sold or consumed during the normal operating cycle of business. In that consumed part there, you can think about insurance, prepaid. So current liabilities, obligations whose liquidation is reasonably expected to require the use of current assets or the creation of other current liabilities. So if you don't have the cash on hand, if you can't convert any of your current assets into cash, then you must borrow money, and that's the creation of other current liabilities. What's the operating cycle? Well, it's the average time intervening, or the average time interval between the acquisition of materials and the final cash realization. So the time between purchasing inventory and realizing cash from the receivable. This is typically 1 year, unless the good being sold requires more time in operation. So tobacco, they have to grow it, harvest it, dry it, package it, and make it readily useful to the customer. So that sometimes that can take more than a year, and if that's the case, then in terms of working capital, your calculations should be based on the larger amount over 1 year. If you have several operating cycles in 1 year, you use 1 year. If you have a non-cyclical business to where there really is no cycle, operation cycle, then you use 1 year. That's the standard. So working capital management. So what does this mean for us in practice? Well, it's a strategy that focuses on maintaining levels of current assets, current liabilities, and the net of the two, working capital. The goal here is to ensure that you have enough cash to meet your current liabilities and operating expenses. So what are some working capital metrics? How do we measure this stuff? We have the current ratio. All of us are familiar with current assets over current liabilities. It's very high level. However, it does not consider the components of current assets. The quick ratio narrows it down further. It does show you the composition of current assets. And even further, your cash flow from operations to current liabilities ratio is very lean because it's actually showing only cash and only cash from operations to be the current asset considered against current liabilities. Of course, to realize cash from operations, many times businesses must convert receivables into cash. And how long that takes accounts receivable turnover ratio, and days in receivables are both good measurements. Inventory management is a very important component to working capital management, and these measurements here are a good way to keep track. So you have inventory turnover ratio. How many times does it turn over in an operating cycle? Accounts payable turnover ratio, and then two more that you can track that aren't ratios: average days in inventory and average days payables outstanding. So you have a payable that you pay your inventory, trade credit, and those are two ways to measure that. Very quick overview of working capital. I hope I didn't butcher it too bad. Thanks for listening.